Professor Dr. Pieter Yonkers from Tilburg University, and when he was, I already mentioned today to him personally, and also I want to re-emphasize it here, when he made a submission to come to this university, I was really happy because his academic interests are so, they are both wide and very kind of Catholic University in Lviv also concentrated. And he's particularly interested in contemporary situation of Christianity, in philosophy of religion. Professor Jonkers served as a dean for research, and then as executive dean, can I say so, of theology. How we call this? School of Catholic Theology.
Yes.
In Tilburg University. His first dissertation, his first academic research was on Hegel, Hegel's concept of faith and knowledge, and he is editor of Hegel's lexicon in German. That is still the only lexicon of that importance. And Professor Jonkers currently is a member of numerous quality assurance boards in different universities and councils. He's very much, I think, we will talk today about God in contemporary continental philosophy. So he's very much interested in history of philosophy, but he's also very much interested, as I mentioned, in the developments in Christianity itself. And because he also has a background in theology and working in the field of philosophy, so you have here really a melting pot of theology and philosophy in one person. And I'm very happy to have you here with us. We will work in this way. The lecture, Professor Jonkers presents his lecture, and then we will go into discussion. And just for you to know, we are also in the online right now, so if you think somebody wants to join us but could not come, let them know that they can find us through event on Facebook. You're welcome.
Thank you for your kind introduction. What I will do is give a paper of about 50 minutes, and then there will be time enough for discussions. If things may be unclear, you always can interrupt me. I'm used to that, to a kind of more interactive way, but if not, so be it. The paper I present today is in fact based on a book which I edited a number of years ago, 2005 more particularly, on God and France, 8 contemporary French thinkers on God. Well, unfortunately, the original Dutch title has a twist in it, because God and France is an expression for having a really great time. So the expression exists in Dutch and in French, but unfortunately not in English. But that's as it is. The book comprises a number of articles by several specialists, philosophers and theologians. My colleague Klaas Pont probably knows Theo de Boer, I guess, and certainly knows Johan Goud. So most of them are are theologians or philosophers. As Professor Bieler said, I have mainly a background in philosophy, a very little one, much less than you, in theology, so I rather qualify as a philosopher. Okay, what I'm doing in this, what I'd like to do in this paper is to give you an idea of a very intriguing discussion in contemporary continental philosophy, namely that so the figure who was actually having a kind of devastating critique on the philosophical approach of God was Martin Heidegger. So he accused basically Western philosophy, and especially modern philosophy, of being a kind of onto-theology, and all of a sudden a number of contemporary French philosophers, some of whom I will discuss today, took that up and found in Heidegger's critique new ways of approaching theology. So the aim of this paper is to explore the reasons why a number of prominent contemporary continental philosophers, mainly from France, have started to pay attention again to the question of God from a philosophical perspective. So it's important to notice that all the philosophers I discussed, so Lévinas, Marion, Derrida, explicitly start from a philosophical perspective. So their concern is not so much theological, but mainly philosophical. That's important to know. Although they make use of various elements from Christian or Jewish theology, their main concern is a philosophical one. What I will do is start with an analysis of Heidegger's philosophy, not as a whole, but in particular his critique of metaphysics as an example of ontotheology, and his the alternative he tries to develop, which he is characterized as the preparation of the leeway in which the divine can manifest itself more truthfully. What that means, we come to that later. And then I will discuss the commentaries of a number of influential French philosophers. I won't discuss all the ones who have been presented in the book, but I'll focus on Lévinas, Derrida, and Marion, and to some degree also on Paul Ricoeur. So all of them have in common that they agree with Heidegger's critique of metaphysics, but that they reject the alternative he offers in a way. Okay, well, I don't know whether you are familiar with the ins and outs of Heidegger's philosophy. I assume, well, a bit. Okay, so I take a very important passage from Heidegger. So for Heidegger, as you know, for Heidegger, being and time are closely related in many respects. So, and that comes down to a statement that every era, according to Heidegger, is marked by basically 4 metaphysical principles. And that every era is marked by it also reflects the fact that being and time are closely related. They have to be considered as fundamental, what he calls decisions about the ways in which being manifests itself through time and as time. The term decisions can be misleading because they are not decisions man-made, but decisions which are taken, so to say, which decisions in the sense that in which being manifests itself. So it's a kind of not intentional process, but the way in which being manifests itself. For Heidegger, so Heidegger would distinguish pre-Socratic philosophy as a certain manifestation of being, and then there is a start of a whole very long period, and typically for all those German philosophers is that they start with Plato and end up with 20th century philosophy and have a very broad picture. I will focus on Heidegger's analysis of modernity, because that is generally considered as very much to the point, whereas his analysis of Plato, Aristotle, and Christian medieval metaphysics is considered as not very correct. Anyway, what Heidegger says, what happens about these 4 metaphysical principles in modernity is, first of all, a decision is taken about truth. And as we all know, what we consider as truth today is identified with certainty. So you have to be certain of something, and this certainty is something which is predominantly certified, so to say, by science, by the exact sciences. Say, well, so truth is what you can calculate, what can be measured, which is objectified, etc., etc. So the result is that humans can assure themselves of the possession of truth. Well, this decision marks of modernity with respect to the pre-modern period. So that's one element of truth. The second one is also a decision about the human. From modernity onwards, and modernity for Heidegger, that starts with Descartes philosophically. So it starts about in the 16th century with the rise of classical or modern science, physics, astronomy, etc., etc. And in philosophy it starts with Descartes. Descartes, who conceives the human person as a subject. So whereas in the pre-modern period a subject could be anything, in the modern period the subject is the ego, the I. Ego is a unique point of reference of the whole of reality. Well, the subject is essentially a being who is able to represent, in particular, to objectify the whole of reality. So the distinction between object-subject, between subjectivity and objectivity, is a typically modern distinction, which again refers to a very important, very influential decision about the human. So the fact that we tend to objectify everything, to put it in front of us, to take a look at it from a distant perspective, is typically for the modern view, modern vision of the subject, human. There's also a decision being taken about being, which means that, well, that's the counterpart of the subjectivity, that reality, being, appears as an object that can be mastered, calculated, and manipulated by the subject. So this view is about the three elements is exemplified for Heidegger in modern science. The combination of these three elements, you find them in science, and that is why Heidegger constantly refers to the contemporary situation as which is dominated by modern science. Finally, and that is what I will focus on, there's also a decision is taken about God. So what is new is that God appears as the ground of reality, but he's integrated in a metaphysical framework. So if you take most prominent philosophical systems of early modernity, take Descartes, take Spinoza, take Hegel a few centuries later, God is the ground, so to say, the ultimate foundation of a metaphysical system which moves in a way from a religious context. So there's a famous quote by Descartes that so he sends a letter to the dean of to the Roman in Paris in those days of the Sorbonne in Paris, and Descartes writes, well, Mr. Dean, there are a few things of which I think that philosophers are more capable to figure it out than theologians. And those three things are the existence of God, the existence of the soul, and the immortality of the soul. So theologians may have their own ideas, but I, Descartes, am serious about that. I can prove that in a almost scientific way. So what you see is that in the beginning of modernity, God appears in a completely different context, which is outside theology and is integrated in a metaphysical framework. Well, this process, which according to Heidegger already dates back to Aristotle, but which becomes really prominent in modern philosophy, is called ontotheology. Is this term familiar with you or not at all? Oh, a bit. Well, That's a crucial term, which means that ontology, which means the philosophical theory about being, or reality as such, is identified in a way with, get a theological twist, but not theological in the sense that you give it, but theology that God is all of a sudden seen as the ultimate foundation of reality. So part, as I said, of a philosophical system, and that has very grave implications for philosophy and for theology. Well, then I give a quote from Heidegger from The Age of the World picture, in German, Die Zeit des Weltbildes, in which Heidegger makes this quote. So, about the consequences of the fact that God gets place, is becoming in a way an object in a philosophical system. And he qualifies it as the loss of the gods. Well, for those of you who are a bit familiar with Heidegger, that is almost a quote of the German poet Hölderlin. Ever heard of? Yeah? Well, so, as you know, Hölderlin is one of the favorite poets for Heidegger, and Loss of the Gods is a quote from a very famous poem by Hölderlin. So, I just read it. The loss of the God is a twofold process. On the one hand, the world picture Christianizes itself inasmuch as the ground of the world is posited as infinite and unconditioned, that's what I just said, as the absolute. And on the other hand, Christendom reinterprets its Christianity as a worldview, namely the Christian worldview, and thus makes itself modern and up-to-date. The loss of the gods is condition of indecision about God and the gods. Christianity itself is chiefly responsible for bringing it about. But the loss of the God is far from excluding religiosity. Rather, it is on its account that the relation to the gods is transformed into religious experience. When this happens, the gods have fled. Again, the resulting void is filled by historical and psychological investigation of myth. Well, this is a long and rather complicated quote, so I'll try to analyze a bit and explain what Heidegger means. Well, as I said, it's a twofold process in which on the one hand the world picture Christianizes, and on the other hand Christendom reinterprets its Christianity as a worldview. Well, let's start with the first element. The Christianization of the world picture becomes apparent in what Heidegger calls elsewhere the onto-theological structure of modern metaphysics. Characteristics for modernity is that philosophy takes a new turn and orientates itself for its ideal of knowing to the model of science. That's what I just explained. According to this paradigm, philosophy understands being as grounded by the ultimate principle on the basis of which the whole of reality can be understood as something radically coherent and transparent. So this ideal of transparency is dominating modern philosophy, and as we can see, is still dominating our way of seeing society, as considering society and reality as a whole. Of course, only God qualifies for being this absolute ground, and consequently, modern philosophy attributes a central position to it. Well, in Heidegger's view, this turn has far-reaching consequences not only for religion, but also and especially for philosophy. Because philosophy understands God as giving ground, it conceives being as completely manifest presence without any obscurity, and truth as the result of an accounting knowledge which is available for a known subject. So that's typically the subject-object distinction and the ideal of certainty. This is the Christianization of the world picture, namely, the basically open, historical and discontinuous destiny of being as a coming to pass, to quote Heidegger, has been reduced to a transparent, representational, objective being grounded in God as its absolute ground and represented by the understanding. So this is the major difference between especially pre-Socratic philosophy and modern metaphysics. However, Heidegger argues, when the picture of the world is Christianized, the gods have fled and the loss of the gods has become a fact. So the Christianization of the world has removed the gods from the element of the holy. It has destroyed the unapproachable character of the divinity, and simultaneously it has annihilated being as heterogeneous, coming to pass and endless origin. So that's one side, so the first side of this what happens. The other side of the loss of the gods is that Christendom reinterprets its Christianity as a worldview. The consequence of this shift is the degradation of the all-encompassing faith in God and the divine worship to a detached view of the world competing with other worldviews. The interpretation of Christianity as a worldview depends on the fact that, in modernity, the world has become a picture for a representing subject. Hence, the term Christian worldview refers to the fact that the human subject is conscious of the fact that he looks at the world from a certain, specifically Christian perspective. On the basis of this conscious stance, he can enter into a dialogue or a confrontation with other worldviews. So as we see now, I assume you have a Christian worldview, just like me, but the term Christian worldview is typically modern worldview, in the sense that in pre-modernity, a Christian worldview did not make sense, because Christianity was the all-encompassing universe of reference. So taking a kind of external stance and saying, well, I have a Christian worldview opposed to a Jewish or a Islamic one or a secular one would not make sense, because Christian worldview was all-encompassing. So this shift manifests in a way the specific position as the subject, who can have whatever worldview and determines from its own autonomous position which worldview he or she likes best. All these worldviews are only possible under the condition that the world as such has already become a picture of which man can make an image or a view. Only against the much larger background of modernity, in which man posits himself for the first time as a subject opposed to the world, namely the object, he is capable of observing or viewing the world as self-conscious, in a self-conscious and detached way. When this occurs, again Heidegger, Christianity has already lost its original Christian character. Why? Well, in its earlier and in Heidegger's view most authentic shape, Christian religion is not a worldview at all, but permeates all spheres of existence. And the crucial difference between this original authentic faith and a modern pious view of the world is that the former is a human response to God's initiative, whereas the latter sees the human subject as the exclusive point of reference on which his religious view of the world is founded. Well, on the basis of this analysis, the question arises whether, in the age of the world picture, it is still possible at all to think and to speak about God in a truthful way. Heidegger is quite pessimistic about the consequences of the loss of the gods. When it has come to this, the gods have fled. That's what Heidegger says. The loss of the gods announces a situation of indecision about them. The holy as the element in which the gods are dwelling, the world as a place that reveals on every occasion God's activity, all these features of an authentic religious existence have vanished and left a great emptiness. Now humans themselves have to decide whether or not God exists, whether or not to be religious. However, precisely at the moment that you want to take a decision on these issues, they notice that the things on which they have to decide withdraw and escape their controlling power. This is the situation of indecision about God and gods. As such, it is not a human decision, but something that happens to humans as a destiny, Schicksal in German, as a consequence of the age of the world picture. Well, the alternative Heidegger offers is the only thing that man can do in this situation, which is our predicament, is to, as Heidegger calls it, prepare the leeway in which the divinity can manifest itself again. Only if man lives within the boundaries of this leeway, he is able to understand the original meaning of the word God. Then I quote a well-known fragment from the Heidegger's letter on humanism, Brief über den Humanismus. Heidegger explains the nature of this leeway. Then you have to, only from the truth of being can the essence of the holy be thought. So he made me say being, and then you have for the sphere and it the essence of the holy. Only from the essence of the holy is the essence of divinity to be thought. That's Heilige in German. And then finally, only in the light of the essence of divinity can it be thought or said what the word God is to signify. Well, with this remark, Heidegger indicates how much preparatory work needs to be done in order to understand again the meaning of the word God in a more authentic way. This is so because the danger of our thinking about God coming too soon is not completely over. Whenever man truly thinks being, he experiences the holy. And the holy, however, does not coincide with the divinity of God or God, but rather is the element in which God lives, which the God live and can reveal themselves to man. In sum, the preparations that are needed to help man in making the transition from the reign of the loss of the gods to a more authentic relationship to God come down to the following. God can only be thought after the divinity has been thought. And the divinity in its turn can only be thought starting from the essence of the holy. This is the leeway in which the divinity manifests itself. However, man can only get access to this leeway when the openness of being has been laid open by what Heidegger calls commemorative thinking, and when man commemoratively dwells in the openness of being. Here, Heidegger means that thinking God and thinking being lie in each other's nearness. Man should put himself under the claim of being in order to think the holy, and only starting from this leeway can we think the divinity and eventually God. Well, no matter how one judges Heidegger's thinking about God, it is clear that he does not only take distance from the representing way of thinking of ontotheology, but also from Christian theology, which starts from God's self-revealing logos in the world. Also, the stress on the holy as the element in which the divinity dwells is at odds with the Christian God, who precisely desacralizes the world. Rather, Heidegger's thinking on this question is related to, as I said, the poet Hölderlin, who reads the gospel without forgetting the Greek myths, which in his eyes are as holy as the gospels themselves. Heidegger himself acknowledges that he speaks only about the gods of the poet and not about the God of Christian revelation. Unfortunately, this point had been negated or neglected by many contemporary philosophers, but that's a different question. So, so far about Heidegger's critique of ontotheology on the one hand, and the alternative he wants to offer for a more authentic, commemorative thinking of God in the domain of the holy, so to say. Well, as we will see, Okay. As we will see, and that will reoccur in all the three figures, all the three philosophers I'll discuss, Levinas, Marion, and Derrida agree with Heidegger's critique of ontotheology, but for various reasons they do not accept his alternative. For Levinas, it's a clear example of what he would call paganism. So he heavily objects, he heavily criticizes Heidegger on this respect, as we will see. In the background, as you may know, is that for Levinas, so all this talk about being and being in the nearness of being, etc., is a manifestation of the complete absence of a ethical consideration of Heidegger, which, as we all know, had fateful effects in the Second World War. I mean, I guess you're familiar with Levinas. I met him a few times, many years ago at conferences. Although he speaks, his German is excellent because he studied in Germany, he explicitly refuses to speak one word of German after the World War. He never ever gave a conference in Germany, although he has been invited many, many times. So it's very many personal, he was a prisoner of war, but his whole family, who came from Kaunas, Lithuania, was murdered during the Holocaust. So this gives a specific background, but again, the interesting thing is that Levinas gives philosophical arguments why he agrees on the one hand with Heidegger and is very much opposed to him on the other hand. Let's start with Levinas. So, the critique of ontotheology plays a crucial role in the writings of Levinas. And I quote from the preface of Autrement qu'être ou au-delà de l'essence, or Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence, which is the second main work after Totalité Infinie of Levinas. The last meaningful sentence of that preface clearly shows that Levinas takes Heidegger's critique of ontotheology as the point of departure of his own thinking. I quote, to hear a God not contaminated by being is a human possibility no less important and no less precarious than to bring being out of the oblivion in which it is said to have fallen, a very quite cynical reference to Heidegger, in metaphysics and ontotheology. Well, from this perspective, Levinas tries to think a God who does not coincide with the supreme being, in that respect he agrees with Heidegger, but is precisely otherwise than being, autrement qu'être. As you know, this refers to Plato, no? No? In the 7 books of Politeia, Plato qualifies the idea of the good as epikena des ousias, which means at the other side of being. Well, Levinas takes up this quote, puts it as the title of his second major work. Thus, Levinas reacts, just like Heidegger, against every way of thinking that has the pretension of being able to thematize God and reduce him to an object of representing thinking. So, in Dieu et la philosophie, Levinas very much opposes to thematize God at all, because thematizing God is an example of objectifying him, and then you are back in this ontological tradition. So, Levinas reacts, just like Heidegger, against every way of thinking that has the pretension of thematizing God. He accuses the ontological tradition of annihilating God's incomprehensible infinity by fitting him into a totalizing system, as happens, for instance, in Hegel, par excellence. As a consequence, the philosophers who belong to this tradition overpower God's transcendence and ignore the infinite difference between God and man. By conceiving God within the network of being, they also create the impression that man, as a thinking and acting being, is the unique starting point of all initiative in the world. As such, man is convinced that he can never be disturbed, thrown off balance, or displaced by the intrusion of the infinite. So, for Levinas, God all of a sudden appears in my world as in what he calls unwelcome guest. So there is not a movement from human being transcending himself upward to God by the analogy of being or whatever. No, exactly the reverse is going on, that God really intrudes into the immanent world. Just for last point, it's no coincidence that Johan Goud wrote this dissertation on the relationship between Karl Barth, the famous Protestant theologian, and Levinas. Because for Karl Barth, God comes senkrecht van oben, right? He intrudes into our world. Well, that's quite similar to what Levinas holds. Okay, we go on with the second instance of deconstructing ontotheology, namely with Derrida. Derrida's thinking, too, is tributary to Heidegger in the sense that he deconstructs, just like Heidegger, the ontotheological representation of God as the supreme being. He radicalizes the problematic presuppositions of ontotheology by situating them in a larger context of logocentrism, which dominates Western thought. So logocentrism is in a way similar, not completely the same, but similar to ontotheology. Well, the term logocentrism refers to a way of thinking in which truth is of a spiritual nature and thus is in principle present for the mind's eye. Within logocentrism, God functions as the transcendental reference, warranting a stable meaning for all our speaking and thinking. God ensures the fact that neither confusion nor constantly changing perspectives deregulate our thinking, but that we, in principle, can rely on an objective truth and a stable world. Derrida's intention is not so much to radically refuse this ontotheological and logocentric way of thinking, but to show that it rests on an unfounded prejudice, namely, God is the point of unification, being the source of all sense and meaning, so a kind of stable point of reference. The ontotheological God appears here as a condition of possibility for thinking reality in terms of presence, representability, and objectivity. We move on to the third representative, Jean-Luc Marion. As far as Marion is concerned, he bases his thinking about God both on Heidegger's critique of the confusion of being and God and on Levinas's objection to the contamination of God by being. And this already becomes apparent from the title of his startling book, 83 if I'm not mistaken, Dieu sans l'être, or in English, God without being. Marion uses the twin concepts of idol and icon to clarify and balance this issue. An idol refers to the human experience of the holy. It represents the holy as seen from a human perspective. The view fixates, and the idol is precisely the point where the movement of the view stops and fixates itself. This is what happens with idols. As far as philosophy is concerned, this attitude refers to a way of thinking about God in terms of construct and concept, of which ontotheology is a striking example. So Marion makes in a way a move from idol as a psychological, in the field of aesthetics, to a conceptual idol. Conceptual idol means fixating and trying to represent God conceptually. As a concept, God is no longer infinite or incomprehensible, but is being fixated within the boundaries of the human capacity of representing. In accordance with Heidegger's critique of ontotheology, Marion writes, the conceptual idol has a site, namely metaphysics, a function, the theology in ontotheology, and a definition, causa sui. Conceptual idolatry does not mean a universally vague suspicion, but inscribes itself in the global strategy of thought taken in its metaphysical figure. Therefore, a way of thinking about God that is not affected by idolatry implies that we should think about God outside the purview of metaphysics. Again, you see here important similarities between Marion, like Levinas and Derrida, and Heidegger in their critique of ontotheology. So the next step is, which will be the more critical phase, is how these authors react to the alternative that Heidegger presents. As already shown above, I start with Levinas again. Levinas's point of departure is a radical rejection of all thinking that conceives God in terms of participation in and community with being. By the way, for those of you who are interested in Levinas for theological reasons, in this respect, Levinas is typically Jewish in his philosophy and non-Christian, because in Christianity the idea of participation is fundamental. At first sight, he seems to be in accordance with Heidegger's project to free being from the forgetfulness in which it has fallen under the influence of ontotheology, but in the same sentence of the quotation I gave above, he places his own project, namely to hear a God not contaminated by being, next to Heidegger, and I would say in opposition to Heidegger, namely as a human possibility, no less important and no less precarious. Well, what does Levinas mean, and how does it relate to Heidegger's thinking? At the outset of the second part of his book, Dieu, la mort et le temps, or God, Death and Time, Levinas comments this issue in detail. Just like Heidegger, again, Levinas considers the ontotheological character of metaphysics as an important aspect of the historical manifestation of being, but then he continues his exploration by asking whether the mistake, I quote, of ontology consists in taking being for God, or rather in taking God for being. Well, what does this mean? Taking being for God occurs when thinking reduces the essential openness of the history of being, namely being as an inextricable intertwining of concealment and unconcealment. As a result, thinking understands being as, or takes being for, the supreme being, God, who can be represented and thus controlled by the subject. So that is Heidegger. On the other hand, however, taking God for being means that philosophy conceives God exclusively in terms of, or takes him for being. In this way, philosophy definitively precludes for itself the possibility of understanding God as otherwise or beyond being. Well, with regards to this issue, Levinas thinks of something very specific. If philosophy takes God for being, this inevitably implies that being becomes the ultimate source of sense. This shuts the door to a radically transcendent sense, that is to say, a sense intruding into earthly being from outside or above. A sense that does not find its origin in the order of sameness, but in the incommensurable other. Levinas wants to show that an authentic sense-giving thinking, namely a thinking that looks for a primordial absolute sense, necessarily implies the explosion or the subversion of being, since being itself only manifests itself as a heterogeneous multiplicity of senses. That, again, is Heidegger's historical concept of being. So, what is actually at stake in Levinas' philosophical project, to oppose God to ontology, is to conceive a new absolute notion of sense which cannot but lie radically at the other side of being. This implies that neither ontology nor Heidegger's thinking of being itself can give access to this primordial layer of sense. So, to put it differently, whereas Heidegger takes the whole tradition of especially modern metaphysics as a sign of forgetfulness of being and of ontology, Levinas agrees with it, but includes Heidegger, whereas Heidegger wanted to separate himself from this tradition, saying, well, I, Martin Heidegger, have a kind of commemorative thinking which tries to think God in a more authentic way. Levinas says, no, Mr. Heidegger, you're completely wrong. You're also a victim or a member of this ontological, in a way, tradition. We can only trace it through ethics, that's Levinas again, as the unconditional appeal of the radically other to me. With this, Levinas wants to tell us the following. In spite of his sustained efforts, which he appreciates, to overcome metaphysics, Heidegger remains indebted to Western metaphysics, which reduces the absolute transcendent sense of God to the historical understanding of the being of beings. Since, according to Heidegger, it is only in the nearness of being that the holy and the divinity announce themselves, and not in something beyond being. Levinas still phrases this complex issue in another way. I quote again, is thinking God by way of ontology the wrong way of thinking about being, the Heideggerian thesis, or is it the wrong way of thinking about God? Does not God signify the beyond being? Now, that is what for Heidegger would be scarcely defensible, although there is a philosophical tradition, Plato and Plotinus, of thinking of a God beyond being. So Levinas asks for a primordial sense, which is radically transcendent with regard to the ever-fluctuating play of diverging sense contexts, which is characteristic for the being of beings. According to Heidegger, this fluctuating play is the historical coming to pass of being, which is the origin of all sense in the world. Going into the sense of being, expression that Heidegger often uses, implies that thinking accepts the realm of the coming to pass of being and expresses its sense. Levinas, however, states that there is a primordial sense which lies beyond the contingency and historicity of being. It cannot but lie at the other side of being, and in that sense goes back to God as the radically other. This again shows that what is philosophically at stake for Levinas fundamentally differs from Heidegger's philosophical agenda. Levinas does not want to safeguard the sense of the coming to pass of being against the metaphysical idea of God. Rather, he tries to prevent being from absorbing all sense, implying that there would be no room for a primordial sense, which radically transcends being. Levinas thus not only repudiates, together with Heidegger, traditional metaphysics, but also rejects, in opposition to Heidegger, the commemorative thinking of being. So, in Levinas's view, Heidegger's overcoming of metaphysics by a commemorative thinking of being should itself be overcome in order to be able to think the intrusion of a primordial transcendent sense. The word of God as the radical other, intruding into the order of sameness. Okay. The second figure is Derrida. Just like Levinas, Derrida also recognizes his indebtedness to Heidegger, to Heidegger's analysis of the intimate relationship between the metaphysics of presence and ontotheology. But he also mentions a distance between his own thinking and Heidegger, albeit in a completely different nature than the abyss separating Heidegger from Levinas. Derrida shows that Heidegger, in spite of all his efforts, does not completely succeed in escaping from metaphysical thinking, since he sometimes remains the prisoner of ontotheology. In particular, Derrida notes that in the work of Heidegger, there are a lot of hidden ambiguities, suggesting a metaphysical rest. And a clear example of this is Heidegger's commemorative thinking of being in his letter on humanism, in which he explores the possibility of a more original thinking of the divinity and God. In his commentary on this passage, Derrida writes that in Heidegger's discourse, one can observe a dominance of an entire metaphorics of proximity, of simple and immediate presence, a metaphorics of associating the proximity of being with the values of neighboring, shelter, house, service, guard, voice, and listening. As goes without saying, this is not an insignificant rhetoric. So if you read Heidegger, you constantly find sentences like that: man in his true destiny is in the nearness of being, that he is the shepherd of being, etc., etc. So his metaphorics is always dominated by nearness. Nearness is also the leading metaphor in Heidegger's speaking about divinity and God. One need only to think of his statement that we can only experience a relation of the divinity to man from the perspective of the truth of being. And according to Derrida, it obviously does not hold to turn Heidegger into a veiled metaphysician, thinking God in terms of representability, presence, etc. So he agreed that would be erroneous. But the nearness that comes up here pertains to the sort of metaphor Heidegger uses to describe the relationship between God and man. With regard to the important issue of the nearness of being to man, and the way in which Heidegger appropriates the sense of being, Derrida's deconstruction results in an ambivalent position. He certainly does not want to reject Heidegger's line of thought as such, if only because that would be impossible, but by laying his finger on the unreflected evidence of the nearness of being to man, he shows a metaphysical rest which has escaped the attention of Heidegger's commemorative thinking. More precisely, Heidegger's destruction of ontotheology has resuscitated this evidence, which had been long forgotten. Under his destruction of an even more original layer of meaning comes to light. Under this destruction, an even more original layer of meaning comes to light, namely the nearness of man and being. Well, Derrida wonders whether this evidence in our times doesn't get derailed. This derailment is surely not a consequence of some human decision, but can only come from an externality outside the realm that is common to man and being. This externality lies outside the circle of light that being casts upon the beings, because it is the very condition of possibility of the sense of being. In his later text, Derrida calls this externality, which he relates to death and violence, calls it God. And interestingly, in one of these works, Derrida follows in a way, to some extent, the tradition of negative theology, which is, in a way, he's often being accused of being a negative theologian, but he attacks negative theology because it's not yet negative enough. So the idea of Derrida, if you're a bit familiar with his thought, is by constantly postponing, never being able to get hold of that. And he accuses Heidegger of forgetting this and replacing this infinite derailment or infinite postponement by a kind of nearness. Well, finally, we come to Marion's alternative. So Marion's interpretation of Heidegger builds on the line of thought of Levinas and Derrida. In his book, God Without Being, he examines Heidegger's new beginning, in which Heidegger sets himself the task of thinking the divine God, or at least preparing the leeway, etc. In this context, Marion sharply criticizes the contested passage of Heidegger's letter on humanism on the possibility of thinking God from the dimension of being. Marion thinks that, for Heidegger, the truth about God can only come from the realm from which truth unconceals itself, namely from being in its enframing and its openness. Thus, being precedes God. And this leads Marion to the conclusion that there is a more fundamental kind of idolatry, which is typical of Heidegger's thinking of being, and which is even more problematic than the idolatry which is characteristic for metaphysics as ontotheology. On the basis of this, Marion gives a penetrating commentary on Heidegger's well-known and often repeated remark that a faithful man, precisely because he is certainly of faith, is perhaps able to conceive the philosophical question of being, but not to fully commit himself to it, because of his inevitably faithful interpretation of this question. Well, Marion reverses this reproach and turns it against Heidegger. Assured of the pre-comprehension of every possible God as being, and of his determination by the anterior instant of being with the big capital B, Heidegger can well conceive and formulate the question. Heidegger can well conceive and formulate the question of God, but can never seriously commit himself to it. So, in that sense, he reverses Heidegger's critique to a critique of Heidegger himself. So for Marion, against all odds, Marion accuses Heidegger's thinking of being as a kind of idolatry, to which he opposes, and that may, especially in this cultural setting, so he opposes idol and icon. An icon is a more authentic way in which we can perceive the divine, not because we perceive the divine, but as in a true icon, Mario remarks, the icon looks at us and transpires us, so to say. Well, in sum, Levinas, Derrida and Marion take a rather ambivalent attitude towards Heidegger's thinking of being as a realm in which the divine can appear. However, they are not the only ones to raise some critical questions in this respect. Ricoeur too wonders why Heidegger constantly avoided the confrontation of his thinking about the divine with the Hebrew thinking, in particular because the latter is marked by a strong relation to the other and to justice, so that Hebrew thinking fundamentally differs from Greek philosophical discourse. Ricoeur notes that Heidegger's thinking about God is heavily indebted to Hölderlin's admiration or nostalgia for the world of the gods of ancient Greece, but pays no attention at all to the God of the Bible. According to Ricoeur, Heidegger's step back out of metaphysics does not adequately take into account the main dimension of Western philosophical and cultural traditions. In his view, Heidegger fails to recognize the radical Hebrew dimension of Christianity, which is primarily rooted in Judaism and only afterwards in Greek tradition. I shortly summarize my conclusion. So, the whole presentation can be summarized as the question, how should God's transcendence be thought in order to prevent him from becoming an idol, but also from having to remain from us having to remain completely silent about it. But this is a constant tension which permeates all these philosophers. So that's a quote from Ricoeur. So that's one element. How can you think God without him becoming an idol, but also without keeping silent about him? And the second, which is interesting for philosophers and theologians, is all these authors include in a way extra philosophical sources, be they biblical, be they coming from systematic theology, in order to think God appropriately. So in that sense, philosophy is again making use of all kinds of extra philosophical insights to make a truly philosophical point. Okay, that's about my paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Does anyone has a question?
I have not the impression that what pertains Marion and Levinas is simply word game. It's a hunting or juggling with words, with terms. Because if we speak of God at all, it means that he is in some way. About whom are we speaking? About God. Is God or not? Mm-hmm. If he is in some way, it means that it is already being. And Levinas is pledging for the Hebrew, for the biblical view of God, not seeing at the same time that he becomes a victim of the Neoplatonic worldview, and in Neoplatonic system of being, the hand, is about to being, in the sense to be about. It is also a sense of being, but Plotinus and later the Dionysius Areopagita wants to show that it is completely other kind of being, not to be identified with the contingent beings. But in this sense, it is a being. And I think Thomas Aquinas' view on transcendentalians, on the ends of the being, is more adequate, because the ends, the being, is proper to everything what exists in every way, in every aspect, and the being is inseparable from other perfections and transcendentalians. It means that the beauty, the truth, the love, and so on, and so on, and so on, could be thought in an infinite way, inseparable from such being, from the ipsum esse subsistence. And it's more appropriate way, it is in no way thinking on God as idol, because it is more appropriate way. Otherwise, we are cheating ourselves, we are speaking about God, but God is not a being. About whom are we speaking? Is God? If He is, it means that He is being. He is not a being like other contingent beings, but He is being itself.
Yes.
And also concerning Exodus 3:14, ego eimi hoon in Greek translation, heye asher heye haya in Luther's translation, ich werde sein, ich sein werde. I will become who I will become. Everything is conceived in the terms of being and becoming. Also in the Hebrew revelation.
Yes, so your argument, if I interpret it correctly, comes from a more traditional Thomistic conceptuality, metaphysics and theology, which is fine. I mean, whether or not, so the problem, but that would be a very detailed research. To what extent Heidegger, Levinas, and Marion Derrida interpret this Thomistic conceptuality correctly, that's a very technical question. I mean, that's I would want to leave that out. Their point is that their point would be first. That's easy, and so Ricoeur in that sense takes a more balanced attitude. So their main point of attack is not so much the thought of Thomas Aquinas, but especially Neo-Thomism, which has become very influential in the first half of the 20th century. So, and you justly can accuse, rightfully or legitimately can accuse Neo-Thomism of using all these concepts about as a subsistence, etc., in a particularly modern way, which reduces or even annihilates God's transcendence. So you have to keep in mind that terms cannot be separated from certain historical concept. That's one of the basic insights of Heidegger, by the way. So whether or not this critique applies to Thomas Aquinas himself, that's a very difficult question. There are numerous different views on that, but it surely applies to Neo-Thomism. Whether or not that is just a play of words, well, you can see philosophy just as a play of words. I mean, that's your opinion. That's not my opinion, but you're free to have that opinion. I would say to my mind, it's far more than just a play of words, because how can you safeguard God's transcendence, which is not only a play about words, but has many theological implications, and also has political implications, because at the moment you think that you can get hold of the divine. You can manipulate him in many, many ways.
I cannot get hold on the infinity of the
No.
being and perfection of God.
Yes,
but
but
on the being, of the infinite and transcendent being
yes, but
of
the
God.
problem is that being in our days, as Heidegger explains, has become a kind of objectifying thing. So to make use of a metaphor which is very precious, both to Levinas and in a different context to Derrida, they use the term trace. They use the term trace in order to identify some way or another God's presence. So the term trace, for Levinas, quite explicit of that, refers to Moses and the burning bush. So he asked, I want to see God, and said, well, no one can see God. The only thing you can do is see the trace of God. So it's only a trace, and the trace does not mean here, if you trace it back long enough, you eventually find God, but it remains a trace. So it never becomes present. That is a metaphoric way of trying to explain in which way God is present. Other terms which Levinas uses is God, as I said, otherwise than being. And even for Plato, he was very careful not to identify the ideas with being as such, but that's why he used the expression epikenes tes ousias, or otherwise than being, in order to point out that we are always at the risk of taking hold of this idea of the good in a way which suits us. So that is, of course, there are basic problems. That's what Ricoeur refers to.